Right, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this, the 12th meeting in 2014 of the Economy, Energy and Tourism Committee. And I can remind everyone present to turn off or at least turn to silent all mobile phones and other electrical devices so they don't interfere with the sound equipment. Can I say at the outset what a pleasure it is to be here in Aberdeen on such a glorious day and in such splendid surroundings. And I'd like to put on record my thanks to the University of Aberdeen, Scotland's greatest university, of course, for very kindly hosting the meeting of the committee. And it is my first visit to this particular building, the Duncan Rice Library, and it is a magnificent setting for the committee meeting, and we're grateful to the university for making it available to us. Now, we have apologies this morning from Alison Johnson, who's not able to be with us, but we are joined by two additional members, Christian Allard, making a remarkably rapid return to the committee after leaving us. Welcome, and Lewis MacDonald, another local member. Welcome to you both. I should also say I'm delighted to welcome our new committee clerk, Dougie Wands, who's joining us for the first time. Welcome, Dougie, and we look forward to working with you in the weeks and months ahead. Right, item 1 on our agenda is a continuation of our inquiry into Scotland's economic future post-2014. And today we are looking specifically at issues around the oil and gas sector. And I'm delighted we are joined today by Mike Tholen, who is Economics Director of Oil and Gas UK, Professor Alexander Kemp, who is Professor of Petroleum Economics and Director of the Aberdeen Centre for Research in Energy, Economics and Finance here at this very university. And thirdly, Penelope Warne, Head of Energy and Senior Partner, CMS Cameron McKenna. Welcome to you all, and thank you for coming along. Now, we've got about an hour and a half or so for this session, but notwithstanding that relatively generous apportionment of time, can I remind all members if they would keep their questions short and focused and to the point. And similarly, if we could have answers that are short and focused, that would be very helpful. And could I ask people, please, to, when they're asking questions, if they could direct them to a particular member of the panel, that would be helpful. And if then you want to answer a question that is addressed to somebody else, if you just catch my eye, I will try and bring you in as time allows, and that way will allow us as many voices to be heard in the time that's available to us. Could I maybe just start off then with a fairly general opening question, maybe address it first of all to yourself, Professor Kemp, and then bring the others in about an issue that you identify in your paper, and is also identified in Penelope Warne's paper about the question of transitional issues in relation to the aftermath of a yes vote if that were to happen in the referendum in September. You talk in your paper, Professor Kemp, about significant transitional issues. In your paper, Ms. Warne, you talk about the fact that this would take time, effort and will to resolve these. Can I maybe ask you then, do you think 18 months as a timescale moving from a yes vote, potential yes vote, to independent Scotland is a realistic timescale to resolve all these transitional issues? What would be the likely cost to industry of these? And thirdly, what would be the risks, particularly if these can't be resolved in that timescale? Let me start with yourself, Professor Kemp, and then I'll bring in the others.
Okay. As far as transiting to an independent Scotland, 18 months, I think, would be very, very tight, and would only achieve a sensible outcome if there was great goodwill on everybody's part, a willingness to compromise. If these weren't present, then it could take considerably longer. What are the transitional issues in the oil and gas sector? Well, the oil and gas companies like to have as much certainty as possible about all the regulations, taxation, and other legislative terms which affect their business. So they would be looking for clarity above all in terms of licensing policy and taxation policies. Specifically on transitional issues, on the tax side, there would be a need to ensure that the activities in the Scottish and rest of UK sectors were divided up. So the companies would have to have establishments in the Scottish sector where they don't have, and would have to have central management to control there, so that there could be effective taxation arrangements. There would also need to be, as well as high policy, there would need to be policy maintenance, and that means technical expertise available to a Scottish government. It could, of course, possibly outsource it to HMRC as it was at the moment. But clearly, there would be a need to ensure that the technical expertise was available in order that the taxation arrangements work smoothly. Similarly, with all the licensing arrangements, the status of the licenses currently issued would have to be clarified very speedily. And again, expertise would have to be established so that the Scottish Government could execute licensing policies in an efficient way. And that again requires a lot of expertise, a lot of data to ensure that these issues are effectively handled. There will be lots of other technical transitional issues. For example, if you had a field in the Scottish sector exporting gas to a terminal in the rest of the UK, what is the status from a sovereignty point of view of that pipeline, and what's the tax status as well? The boundary between the Scottish sector and the rest of the UK sector would also clearly have to be established. There would be some, maybe many fields where there wouldn't be much doubt, but there would be some where there might be scope for argument. So that would be a summary of what I see as the big transitional issues.
Thank you very much, Professor Kemp. Maybe I can ask you the same question, Penelope Warne. Professor Kemp, you indicated that there's a whole range of issues to be dealt with. Would you agree with that?
Thank you. I agree with what Alex has said, and I hope that all of you will have had time to read through my paper, which I did in a very deliberately detailed way, because I thought that this would be helpful to every interested party as a checklist of things that needed to be done. There are an awful lot of very small issues to be done, but what you'll be primarily interested in is in the big things that need to be done. I put those, into sort of several different categories. There's the boundary, which Alex referred to, and I'll come back to that. There's the licenses together with their model clauses, which are likely to be easy to transfer, and much has been said about that in the white paper, but there are some complex legal issues around that I'd come back to. There's the administrative reorganisation of setting up the infrastructure to deal with this in Scotland, which is another issue. There's the English-Scots law issue, which might seem like a small issue, but since 1964, all the agreements in the North Sea, whether in the Scottish sector or the English sector, are all governed by English law for tax and trusts reason. So you can overlay Scots law onto that. It's perfectly possible. But the reason it's been kept in one jurisdiction is to avoid unnecessary litigation, because where you have two different legal regimes, you give companies the opportunity to start litigating. So that's why that's an issue. There are 13,000 treaties which Scotland would need to renegotiate. Now, many of these may be small issues, but many of them will be big issues. What would need to be done, in my view, is you could meet this 18-month deadline if you had a large number of people helping to do that, but you'd have to prioritise what were the major treaties, and then there would have to be a lot of people negotiating those treaties. Going back to the boundary issue, I haven't written a lot about that in my paper, but there are many, many examples of settling the boundary issue in sort of a similar sort of situation. If these are agreed between the two parties, then that could be done quite quickly. If they're not agreed, they typically find themselves in the International Court of Justice, and that may take 10 years.
So, when Professor Kemp told us a few minutes ago he thought an 18-month period was very tight, would you agree with that?
I think you'd need an enormous amount of private consultants helping to be able to achieve that. You know, the things that are unquantifiable that we can't know is whether things like the boundary dispute would be agreed or not.
So that would be a goldmine for lawyers, presumably.
Well, it's an area where lawyers would get involved. Certainly, it's a big issue.
Okay, thank you. Mike Tholen?
Right, thanks. I'd defer to my other two members of the panel here for many of the points they've raised. As Alex Kemp mentions, though, certainty and clarity are key things to maintain investor confidence, and not just, I emphasise, for the 60 or 70 oil companies that drive most of the investment in the North Sea, but there are 3,000 or 4,000 supply chain companies, many of which are north of the border, but many of which are south of the border, and service our industry. So to keep the confidence high and clear means that people must know what's happening, when it's happening, and there'll be the minimum of uncertainty during that period. And I think it's particularly essential that we don't just focus on the oil companies, but the many companies that service this industry, because they have the eyes on many balls. And if this ball is one which slips, they will actively service many other countries abroad, which is great for our exports picture, but we could risk then losing the support we need to maintain the fabric of our own industry.
And lastly, can I just ask, have your member companies, or any of them, started making assessments of the likely cost to them of this transition?
I'm not aware of any cost assessments being made myself.
Okay, I'll bring in Dennis Roberts.
And good afternoon. I'll maybe start with yourself, Mike, because you've used a couple of interesting words and when you were responding to Murdo, words like uncertainty and confidence. I want to Webb that a great deal of uncertainty is caused sometimes by the tax regime that's imposed within the sector. For instance, Malcolm Webb has been reported to say that since the 2011 $10 billion sort of tax grab on the industry, the industry still feels a bit sort of scarred by that and still a bit nervous around maybe future taxation. Whereas the chief exec from Enquest has suggested that he feels that there may be more certainty from what he's heard from the Scottish Government perspective in terms of the future fiscal regime. What's your own comments about that?
I think it's a brave man who wants to disagree with his chief executive, not least if this is being taped, but there we are. We're still very good talking terms, I'd emphasise. As an industry, as I'm sure you're aware, uncertainty is part of our day job. We have to manage uncertainty, not just in fiscal matters, regulatory matters, reservoir uncertainty, technical uncertainties, financial and fiscal uncertainties. And within that, we had to create a business that's successful and delivers clearly for the shareholders and for the country concerned. So there's always a case to manage uncertainty. I think it's fair to say that the industry was wholly opposed to the tax increase in 2011 because any further
You didn't know about it, did you?
Sorry?
You didn't know about it at the time? You didn't know it was going to happen?
We didn't know until after it happened, and we didn't know about it then, I'd certainly say that. And I'd also say that in many ways, I think that seems to be a high watermark in terms of engagement with many governments on tax matters. Despite the tax increase, there have been a lot of good moves since then to refocus on a longer term and more pragmatic focus on the true prospectivity of the basin. And that led indeed ultimately to the Wood Review, which is trying to really promote a new relationship between the government both in terms of its regulatory form, the government in its fiscal form, and the industry, to really try and recognise that in this new era of a very mature North Sea, that we have to work together in new ways to get the most from the basin.
Yeah, and do you feel that what you've heard from the Scottish Government in saying that, you know, they're projecting greater certainty and stability because they understand that that's what the industry require? Do you feel that, you know, post-referendum on the 19th September, if there's a yes vote, the industry will feel a bit more secure, given what the Scottish Government have said?
I think any industry must be pleased when any government mentions the word certainty and tries to build confidence. But for any industry looking at things which are yet to happen, it must be cautious to see what the proof of the pudding is.
Yeah, thank you very much. Professor Kemp. Same question, basically. It's just
Okay.
your opinion.
Well, certainly, above all, the oil industry likes clarity, predictability, and as much certainty as possible regarding the taxation environment. And of course, the oil industry is a bit different from others in that the investments and the investment decisions relate to very long-term activities. And historically, in the UK, with successive governments, there's been evidence of too much attention being given to the relatively short term, by which usually we mean 5-year Red Book budget periods. So that's just part of political life. It's not about any one political party. So looking ahead, as Mike indeed said, we are now in an era where the industry is quite mature, which means that a whole lot of projects, even with $100 oil, are not particularly large and not particularly offering major materiality to the investors. And so therefore, there's a greater need for some certainty about the taxation and regulatory environment. So a Scottish government can make statements, and of course it has made statements about consultation, always going to be present if there's any proposed tax change, and no intention to raise taxes. But of course, these kind of things, it can be said, but if I were the investor, you would just be interested to see what actually happens at the time. So yeah, certainly some caution on the part of investors, I think would be appropriate until if a full picture has been revealed by a new government.
Yeah, your colleague Professor John Patterson feels that post-referendum, if there's a yes, an independent Scotland would afford that stability. He's fairly confident in that. He made a fairly broad statement regarding that.
Well, the leaders of the Scottish Government have certainly shown a keen interest in the North Sea oil and gas industry. They're also very well aware that the contribution of the oil and gas cluster, the supply chain, is very important to the Scottish economy. In the last few years, it's been, if not the only growth sector, the most obvious growth sector. So that should influence policy making. So you can look at these kind of signals, but having been around a long time and witnessed many changes of government, I've also seen changes in short-term thinking as well.
Thank you very much. Penelope.
Well, obviously, I come at it from a slightly different angle because I come at it from, you know, a regulatory perspective. If the well, at the moment, and if the Scottish sector were to become independent, you still have 4 types of law interacting in the Scottish sector, both now and later. You have Scots law, English law, European law, and international law, and that is complicated. And I've set out in my paper a bit about how all those different things interrelate. The thing that is a challenge is that all the rules are going to change if we have Scottish independence. Now, it's completely possible to re-establish the regime, but there's a huge amount of negotiation which will need to happen, between the two governments, but also in Scotland with the EU and Scotland with international countries. And of course, the oil and gas industry is very, very global, and so a lot of things that are done here in Aberdeen, go out, from the supply chain all over the world, and that infrastructure currently exists. But if we have an independent Scotland, we need to put in place all those, replicated regimes to allow things to happen. Things like free movement of goods, which would be very, very important for the oil industry because they send, manufactured parts all over the world, which is one of the fantastic things about Aberdeen. But all of that would need to be put in place in some way. So it's just a very large amount of legislation which needs to be dealt with.
Okay, thank you for that.
Thank you. Richard Baker.
Thank you very much, Penelope. We both about the uncertainty. I wondered to what extent you felt it was crucial for the industry to have certainty over the important issue of meeting decommissioning costs, because clearly the costs of decommissioning have been assessed to be £40 billion plus. I think, Professor Kemp, if I read your graph right, it was a big assumption there. Do you think you put a figure around £45 billion on that? I mean, these are huge costs. The UK government said it will meet between 50 and 75% of tax relief on decommissioning costs. So to what extent is that an important issue, and to what extent do you feel we have clarity at the moment about the meeting of decommissioning costs in an independent Scotland if that was to happen?
Decommissioning is something which as an industry we're obviously very excited about, not least we're actually desperately keen to put it off for as long as possible and to do it as cheaply as possible, because that is in everyone's interests. I look forward to there being a successful industry in decommissioning, but I'm not in a hurry for it to pick up just yet. First of all, as an industry, any oil company taking on an oil field or starting a new oil development is tested by the British government for its ability to pay its bills and make sure that it can pay for decommissioning when it gets there. And that is still the fundamental part of the regime. The company in the first place has to be equipped to pay those bills. As time's gone on, it's recognised that both the industry and the government through tax relief will end up paying for part of that bill. And most recently, over the last years, since 2011, the conversation picked up big time. We've come to a point now where there is a contract which guarantees the government share of the decommissioning relief, not relief typically for about 50% of the costs, depending on the tax regime, the field, and all sorts of things. What that's done is de-risked a large sum of money so that companies know that they need only worry about providing their share of the bill, albeit they will make sure and they have to provide their share of the bill. And the industry is concerned and is focused on whichever government continuing to offer that guarantee. And the announcements so far that have been made have continued to indicate that a Scottish government, as with the British government, would provide that certainty. And we will continue to operate on that basis. Companies have to accept and respect the government's ability to give its guarantees.
So perhaps I could ask Professor Kemp, because if there's no agreement between the Scottish government and UK government in the future, in independent Scotland, on who pays decommissioning costs, and if it's simply no agreement, and one can see a situation where Scottish government's, because of the disagreements on currency, not paying its share of the national deficit, there's simply no agreement that there will be any joint payment for decommissioning costs, and that bill will fall on the Scottish government alone. And so that's going to be a £20 billion plus bill potentially, isn't it?
Okay. Well, we need to distinguish the idea of tax guarantee for decommissioning. And certainly in the white paper, the Scottish Government has said that they are accepting that, and they will provide the same sort of contract. The problem area could be when you have fields being decommissioned post-independence, and so they claw back the decommissioning losses against petroleum revenue tax and corporation tax, supplementary charge, into years prior to independence. That's quite a tricky problem, and certainly there you would need goodwill on the part of the two governments to agree what would happen in that circumstance.
But it's surely if there's no, for example, Scotland's not paying its share of the deficit after disagreement on currency, the idea that the UK government would pick up part of the tab for that seems pretty unlikely.
Well, you are moving from a situation where the fields, say, were decommissioned in the Scottish sector after Scotland became independent. So you claw back your losses into a time before Scottish independence. Well, that's actually, when you go back as far as that, that's actually against tax which had been paid to the UK government. So that does open room for discussion about how you would deal with that. But clearly, from the investor's point of view, they would want clarification on that, and they would certainly want some assurance that they would get the full and proper relief.
So my final question, Queen, would be, whatever circumstance, it seems clear those costs will need to be met. In an independent Scotland, need to meet, tax-free from decommissioning to the tune of tens of billions of pounds. That will have a significant impact on tax revenues in the future. So even with it being a maturing field and tax volatility which comes with that, decommissioning costs are going to impact on tax revenues in the long term, aren't they?
Oh, certainly, yes. And you're right. In our newspaper, not quite published yet, we are saying that from now till 2050, it could be 45 billion.
45 billion pounds.
And of course, a big chunk of that, a very big chunk, would be in the Scottish sector. So that's all correct. But although that's an enormous number, we shouldn't get it out of hand, out of proportion, because from now till 2050, our own modelling of the field development costs were over 120 billion, and they're all tax deductible as well. So it's true that the decommissioning costs are big. The problem really is because they come after the income from the fields in question is finished, and so that creates a problem for everybody, the investors and the government.
Sorry, Professor Kemp, this paper you're talking about, when's this due to be published?
And well, just polishing it off now, within 2 weeks.
Oh, right, okay.
And it will be showing the kind of scenarios we have in this paper, but much more detail.
Okay. Well, that's something to look forward to. Mike McKenna.
Just a brief supplementation, just while we're on this subject, because Richard Baker seems to be implying that although the UK government has benefited, I think, to the extent of 300 billion of revenues from the oil and gas industry, and I think that's in today's terms over all these years, the Scottish government should pay out tax relief in respect of the decommissioning of infrastructure that generated that income to UK government. Surely there would be some reasonable and equitable arrangement for who pays what in terms of decommissioning, and that it's not beyond the wit of man to decide on a reasonable and fair means of doing that.
Who would like to answer that? Mr.
That is a wider question. Who has benefited from that over the last 30 years? Hopefully, we've all benefited from it. So the question you pose is, well, it's political economy, you might say, but it's more political than the economics. The one that I posed is more a technical tax issue. When you've got field being decommissioned post-independence, you claw back your losses into a pre-independence situation, then it's clear that there should be some sharing of the tax relief there. I think that's clear, and precisely how you do it would require discussion, negotiation. The wider issue of who's benefited from fields produced over the last 40 years, and therefore who should pay for the government's share of the decommissioning cost. That's more of a much wider political type issue, I think.
I mean, only just to say, you know, and I understand your question that, you know, surely there's a way of, you know, reaching a conclusion, but I think from a legal perspective, you know, the blunt situation is that it's a negotiation.
Thank you. Okay, thanks. Mike, you got another question?
No, really, that's just to pick up while we're on that.
Okay, well, I mean, I think Richard Baker's question's finished, so you were next on my list. So
Okay,
another
yeah,
question you want to ask? Carry on.
I have many questions.
Well, not too many, I hope.
Yeah, I mean, it strikes me that, as I understand it, there have been about 16 major fiscal changes to oil and gas over the last decade, and I've lost count of the number of UK energy ministers over that period. Do you feel that that's been helpful to the oil and gas industry in terms of maximising the economic benefit and in terms, indeed, of maximising revenue? Well, anybody on the panel, but maybe Professor Kemp would start off.
Okay, well, certainly not. The multiple changes in taxation arrangements make things very difficult for investors who are trying to make long-run investment decisions, because, you know, fields can last 20, 30 years, or some of them much shorter. So they're very much long-term. And a major change in the taxation during the lifetime of a field is quite unsettling to the economics and all round. So, of course, governments, as I've said before, tend to, when it comes to budgetary issues, tend to concentrate on the budget 5-year period, which is not really appropriate for long-term projects, long-lasting projects like the oil industry. It may not be so bad for some other industries where the relevant period could be 5 years, but when it's much longer than that, it can be very unsettling. Of course, we know why it's happened this century. We've had 3 big tax increases because the price has risen from, you know, $20 to over $100. But in the modelling we've done, it's clear that the cost base follows up with a bit of a lag, follows on. So for the last few years, we've had rampant cost inflation, and taxes which have been related to an increase in the oil price often don't take into account what has happened. The costs have increased with a bit of a lag. And also, as I suggested earlier, the last increases in tax haven't given proper credence to the growing maturity of the basin personified by smaller fields, lower materiality. So the record really, as far as taxation policy is concerned, and in terms of maximising economic recovery, which is the widely accepted objective, has left quite a bit to be desired.
Thank you. Any other witnesses got any comments on that?
I'd probably add that there have been over the last 50 years many changes in the taxation of our industry, and indeed many energy ministers in many different governments. So the inevitability of ministerial change, and indeed to some extent fiscal change, is embedded into the basin and into our psyche. But there have been too many changes, and indeed most recently the tax increases have been very hard to bear by an industry which is trying to do some very difficult things. Again, as I mentioned earlier, I think that the government has certainly taken the conversation for our industry on at a higher level, not least now we are very often engaging with the Secretary of State for Energy on the important matters, the assets of the national assets of our industry, the hydrocarbon potential and its future, which I think is a better and a more formative conversation. And again, the Wood Review is trying also to build on that to get a more positive and a more dynamic long-term reflection of the challenges the industry faces in the 21st century. So we could do better, I think, as a country on how we do tax changes, but certainly I think the conversations now have come to a new place. And we're certainly also, I think, interested to see what comes both out of the fiscal review that the British Exchequer has announced, and indeed the Fiscal Commission, which is currently ongoing through the Scottish Government as well.
I don't think from the legal perspective there's anything to add.
Sure. In a way, I'm grateful for those answers, because it kind of leads me on to my next question, because our convener, Mr. Fraser, just at the end of our meeting just last week, described the bareboat tax as a tax evasion loophole that the Chancellor has now sewn up. And tax avoidance, or was it?
That's a different.
Okay. I bow to your superior knowledge of those matters, but I just wondered what the panel felt about this bareboat tax.
Sorry, thank you. Perhaps I could maybe pick off the conversation here. Bareboat charter arrangements are used by a whole range of industries, not just our own, and they remain and still are entirely legitimate commercial arrangements. What the Chancellor announced in the budget, and indeed before that in the consultation, was a change in how they would be treated fiscally. What that has done is obviously move the fiscal goalpost for part of the industry, but there was also a fairly deep period of consultation before that, which reflected on some of the broader measures they were proposing. And so ultimately they targeted a smaller base to tax than they could otherwise have done. So it's a measure which will have added to the cost of our industry, certainly, but one which is not as big or as deep as could have been envisaged when the consultation was started.
So you welcome it, and you feel that you're in agreement with Mr. Fraser about this tax avoidance loophole, or do you feel that it's an unhelpful tax?
Bareboat charter, as I said before, bareboat charter measures are perfectly permissible and widely done by a range of industries, not just our own. The renewable sector, amongst others, also employs similar measures, and they are fully supervised by HMRC and fully endorsed by them.
Yeah. In its current format, then, do you feel that it will be helpful for the industry or not helpful?
Any changes to the tax regime inevitably causes some wrinkles, and those wrinkles are ones we'd rather not have. At a time of very high drilling costs, anything which adds to costs clearly is unattractive, but the Exchequer has announced that it will look again a year from now at the impact, and clearly the industry is watching to see what it can do to assess that impact.
Okay, thank you. Professor Kemp, any?
Yes. there is room for debate about the type of change which has been made, and what is a reasonable taxable income from a UK perspective. But it could hardly have come at a more unfortunate time, because the increased cost, including the tax, will be passed on by drilling companies in higher drilling rig rates, and that will affect, in particular, exploration, because mobile rigs are used for exploration, and to some extent will affect development drilling as well, because there will be some mobile rigs used for development drilling. When I say it could hardly have come at a worse time, it's because the drilling rig rates are very, very high at the moment, particularly for semi-submersibles used for much of the UK continental shelf apart from southern basin. So these rates will go up at a time when our exploration effort is very, very low. Widely quoted, the 15 exploration wells only drilled last year. So, and also, who knows what will happen to the drilling rigs themselves. The Oil and Gas UK Activity Survey very clearly showed two of the main impediments to exploration this year were shortage of rigs and shortage of finance. So, hopefully, more rigs will come in this year and get a few more wells drilled. But to impose a higher tax at this time, it may not produce the answer we want. So it's a question of the knock-on effect, which is bothersome if our prime interest is on the activity level in the North Sea.
Thank you very much. That's very helpful.
I mean, we've heard about the tax regime in the UK. How does that compare with the tax regime in, say, for example, Norway and the sector? Mike Tholen.
Gosh, the tax regime is part of a wider investor dynamic. If you look around the North Sea, tax rates vary from 50% and less through to 78% as the headline rate in Norway, and indeed 81% in the UK. So there are a whole range of taxes applied to industry across the North Sea. The Norwegian tax regime has some aspects which treat investments slightly differently from the UK, but typically they compete on a whole range of tax rates depending what activity you're looking at. It's very hard to pick a favourite tax regime. I suspect the one before 2002 in the UK was quite an attractive one.
Right, so it's pretty much the same across.
There's a whole range of rates, so there are good and bad aspects of all of the regimes.
Right, okay, thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I wonder if I know we talk about North Sea oil, but I wonder if I may be a bit more adventurous and take us into another area which is still classified as North Sea oil. For the last few years I've been doing a lot of research in the National Archives, talking to people who were involved about oil in the Firth of Clyde. And I noticed that Professor Kemp, you produced a paper on the economics of petroleum exploration and development in the west of Scotland. Despite the poo-pooing of the evidence, which is I have in a folder, both from those involved, from the oil exploration companies, and indeed from a quote from the Secretary of State for Scotland at the time, that there was a lot of oil in the Firth of Clyde. That has now been supported by and at the time we had planning permission for an oil refinery at Campbellton. We built a village for oil workers at Port Maddy, and we now have a situation of Parkmead Group
on round 27, exploring off Tyree. I have a meeting and had correspondence with people in the Irish government regarding the millions and millions of barrels that are in the Wrathan Basin. Yes, I'm just coming to the question. I wonder if you can help me with this in terms of, when we talk about this, are we concentrating too much on North Sea oil? And what do you expect the volumes to be, particularly when we've had quotes that North Sea will continue to provide oil for another 100 years from Dr. Richard Pike? What's the answer to the volume question, given all of that?
Okay, well, the paper which I've summarised for you in my memorandum, and which will be published in a couple of weeks in much more detail, models the future of the UKCS up till 2050. We stopped the model running then. So we are saying that we could produce between now and 2050 about 14 or 15 billion barrels of oil equivalent. That's with present policies and the Wood Review proposals on production efficiency and exploration having a partial success, a reasonable amount of success. So we've produced 42 to date. We are saying 14, 15 with moderate success with the Wood Review type proposals and some more tax relief. But if things go very well, then there could be more than that. So Oil and Gas UK, and I'm sure Mike will...
Professor Kemp, what about the west of Scotland? Clare Ridge, Parkmead Group, the Firth of Clyde, the Wrathan Basin.
Okay,
isn't it the case
if you then ask me where's all the oil and gas coming from, looking ahead over the period to 2050, then an increasing and large part of the oil anyway, not so much the gas, will be from west of Shetland. So it's well known that a very large investment is taking place in the Clare Field Phase 2 and the Shehallian redevelopment. And in our modelling, there will be more to follow, Clare Phase 3, maybe even Clare 4. So there will be a substantial amount of oil from west of Shetland, and it will pay an increasing share of the total as we go beyond 2020 to 2030. So yes, we think possibly quite a lot, but of course there is a lot of risk there. If you look at the Department of Energy's figures on yet to find, as they call it, quite a big part of that is west of Shetland. So yes, there is substantial from west of Shetland, substantial potential. The only extra point to make there is that it's very, very expensive. So we would need a relatively high price to make a lot of it economic.
I'm trying to get you to confirm the evidence I already have, that the MOD stopped drilling, stopped all the drilling in the Atlantic margin and the Firth of Clyde. So I'll take on the basis that the Firth of Clyde is west of Shetland, that we will see exploration. Well, there's been exploration.
In the Firth of Clyde?
Yes. Well, there's a production licence that BP had in 1984, and they weren't allowed to exercise it. So, anyway, just coming back to volume.
I presume that's because they don't think there's much there.
Well, I have to tell you, Professor Kevin, I'm sure you would have known that the VGS survey disputes that. I was surprised you didn't know that. Anyway, let me go on.
A lot more don't know than me.
Let me go into what you do know, if I may. You were in an interview with Gordon McIntyre. Kemp said that, quote, the oil production figures produced by the Office of Budget Responsibility were 6 billion barrels fewer than we would expect. I wonder if you'd share...
I can comment on that.
Yeah, let me just finish this, if I may. I wonder if you comment on the OBR. I mean, because there is a view that many of the OBR staffers, in fact, have been working in London financial services and not in the oil industry. And we have a quote from Alistair Darling that right from the start the Tories used the OBR not just as part of the government, but as part of the Conservative Party they have succeeded in strangling what could have been a good idea at its birth. What's your view of the OBR and its forecasting capabilities? Mike?
Well, as far as the oil and gas projections, I can make comments on that. So they produced a long-range projection back in July, they had about 10 billion barrels oil equivalent being produced from now until 2040. And I saw that the Department of Energy's most recent publication just a couple of weeks ago was saying just over 10.2 from now to 2050. So my view is that that is a low figure, and it would be very disappointing if by 2050 we'd only produced 10.2 billion barrels, and would be well below what's perceived to be the long-range potential. And if we didn't produce more than 10 by 2050, then the infrastructure would all become largely uneconomic, which is why I think that the Wood view is correct in saying we've got to move now to have more effective regulation, to enhance the volume of exploration, enhance the production efficiency, so that we not only get a big payback in the next 5 years, but we have long-term investment in infrastructure to ensure that when we come to 250, we have the potential to produce a lot more.
I'm not sure that tells me what your view of the OBR is, but it's very helpful.
Well, I did say that their projections are quite pessimistic.
Mike, do you have a view?
Gosh, I'm probably struggle to speak on the quality of the nature of the forecast from OBR. I would simply observe that there are many different ways of making forecasts, and Professor Kemp has a set of models which do things one way, and clearly OBR another. But I haven't sat and studied their models to be able to speak on the diligence of them. What I would say more broadly about the sort of numbers that are flowing to and fro, the future is quite literally for our industry what we make it. People's current plans probably see production of 6 or less billion barrels of oil and gas coming out of the North Sea, and I use that in a collective term. I can't speak about the Clyde in quite the same diligence, but certainly in the North Sea, Russia Shetlands included. And everything else above and beyond that has to be worked at particularly hard, not least if we're to get to the 10 billion barrels. And certainly, if you look back, we've seen 40-odd billion barrels extracted, where there have been some real peaks of production, and then we've fallen back from that peak. We have to see a period of strong production rather than decaying production, and that is very much in industry's hands to invest strongly under the right circumstances. And it then also does need us to look under new stones, from technology, and to look under new exploration opportunities, and not for once making any jokes about the Clyde, but quite the reverse. There's a lot of work going on at the minute to look at areas where the BGS and others are identifying prospectivity which people have either mistaken or maybe discounted because the technology didn't match their ability to secure it. So the future still, for whoever is exploiting the basin, is one to be made, but every last barrel has to be fought for, both in technology and cost.
Yeah, it's just... apart from the ups and downs of the forecast, I'm surprised that, as Professor Kemp points out in his paper, that increases have been due to, there's been huge increases in investment. I can't see companies doing that unless there's a rationale behind it. I want the last question, if I may, for Penelope. And firstly, I know that you've been doing the job, but congratulations on taking over as senior partner officially on this Thursday of CMS Cameron. In the Steptoe and Johnson, I almost said Steptoe and Son, in the Steptoe and Johnson report, which you may be able to comment on, it says, looking at the benefits as well as the liabilities of further development in oil, it says inevitably Scotland would have some liabilities on the part of the Scottish Government under different legal regimes. But it does start off by saying prior to that, it is hoped that an independent Scotland would bring benefits not offered by the present state of affairs. I wonder if you can comment on that.
I mean, I'd like to say, and sort of partly coming on from the previous question as well, obviously I'm not a geologist and I'm not an economist, I'm a lawyer. But the industry is very high value, high risk and high investment, which is why the stability is needed. But I would say, you know, partly in comment to your previous question and to answer your current question, technology seems to move forward, and that actually ideally should be better for everyone, should be better whether we are together or an independent Scotland, because areas which are, you know, not economic today may become economic tomorrow. But what is absolutely clear to me, and it's the most important message, you know, to give you all today, and it's not impossible to do, but it is absolutely essential that the regulatory regime is clear and certain, because that's just as much as an important aspect as for the economic and tax side. If nobody understands the rules of the game, then people will become nervous. So it's terribly important, whether there is going to be an independent Scotland or not, that everybody focuses, you know, very much, because in the post-Macondo era...
Sorry to interrupt, it does say it would bring benefits not offered by the present state of affairs. I mean,
well, I think, well, just to mention, I was just coming on to the fact that post-Macondo, the worldwide oil and gas industry went round the regulatory regimes of the whole world to look for good and bad examples, and the UK regime was held to be a very fine example of what we have currently is a goal-setting regime, so that it puts the onus on the oil companies to provide and demonstrate and prove that they have the very best, for example, safety cases for the North Sea, rather than, if you compare that to other regimes in the world, you will have a prescriptive regime where it says you must do the following 80 things when you are drilling, but that doesn't necessarily give you the very highest standards in the world, because things change. So what I would say to you is that I think we actually have a very, very good regime in terms of legal infrastructure, and it's very important that if we move to an independent Scotland, that is preserved. So, you know, it's important for everybody to concentrate on that.
Okay. Margaret, would you go to the question?
Professor Kemp, since 2002, production has halved and operating costs have doubled. What can the oil and gas industry do to address that? Or indeed, is there anything that they can do? Because obviously we know that, you know, new wells are more costly.
Okay. Well, as far as the production is concerned, the decline rate has been quite brisk or steep in the last few years, for two reasons. One, in the last few years, not all that many new fields have been brought on stream, okay, for one reason or another.
What would those reasons be?
Okay, well, the discoveries over the last few years haven't been all that many, because exploration has been relatively low. However, there are lots of fields which are discovered, but are not economic post that. Okay, so that's one reason. The second reason is that what's come to be called production efficiency has declined seriously over the last few years. Production efficiency is the ratio of the actual production over the maximum efficient rate, and it's gone down from 81% 2004, 61% 2012, because a lot of downtime in fields reflecting technical problems and so on. So I would highlight these two problems rather than lack of reserves altogether. So to rectify the situation, we need to do several things. On the production efficiency, more investment in inspection, maintenance, repair, more effective regulation or stewardship. On new fields, and that's where incentives, some more incentives are needed through the tax system and less disincentives. More effective regulation by procuring collaboration. We're hearing a lot of initiatives on cluster developments to develop a cluster of fields so that collectively they're viable, whereas individually they may not be. All that kind of thing. So I think the point that I would maybe highlight is that the decline can be stopped. It needn't just inexorably continue. It can be stopped, and the Wood Review highlighted these areas I've mentioned, like the need for collaboration, the need to enhance production efficiency, and hinted at the tax system and helping to get more new fields coming on stream. Cost inflation, indeed, has of course been a major issue, and the fact that it has escalated along with the oil price gives to a lot of outside listeners or viewers a misleading impression that it must be fantastic, $100 oil, but the costs have gone up enormously as well. So my own view is that some of the post-Wood Review initiatives that the regulator should take should also be related to getting unit costs reduced. More collaboration is the thing he's highlighted, common use of infrastructure, but there may be a need to revisit the type of contracts between oil companies and the contractors, risk-reward sharing contracts to incentivize cost reductions that way. Also, the industry has suffered from a skill shortage for a long time, so developing more skills, attracting more people into the industry.
Yeah, thank you for that, because that was my next question, was on skills and how we attract more people into the industry. Can I always just add that we are talking about a reducing reserve of gas and oil, which, so it is going to be declining.
Well, clearly it's a non-renewable resource, and if we produce some, there's less left, though we can discover some more. My own view is that there still is considerable potential, but it is more difficult because mostly they'll be in small fields, so the cost per barrel will be high just because of that. And so we need more innovation, more R&D, and all the collaboration and so on that I've mentioned.
Right, okay. And the collaboration will all depend on the negotiations if there was to be an independent Scotland. Could I just ask as well on EU and what would happen if we became independent and we were not part of the Union, the European Union?
Well, that's obviously been a matter of, a lot of debate, but something has to happen because you can't have a vacuum of law. Therefore, there can be some temporary arrangements to compensate if EU law were not to be applicable in some instances in a newly independent Scotland. But those things would all have to be negotiated. which can be done, but they would have to be done. You know,
So that can all be done within the 18 months that was mentioned?
I think 18 months is quite challenging because, but it depends how many people you put onto a task like that, because somebody would have to do some very, very detailed analysis, and then there would have to be work parties to organise this. I think you were touching on one issue though, which is important, and I don't know if it's interesting for this group, but the current administration through DEC and the Treasury would have to be replicated in Scotland, and it's potentially a challenge to see who has the skills and expertise to take up those many jobs, also an enhanced role because of the Wood Review, because I don't, the current people who do that job in the UK are resource constrained, so I don't think it would come from that group, and I don't think that would in any event be acceptable to a newly independent Scotland. So where are those people who are going to take those roles in order to do all these things? I mean, presumably they can be found, but it is a job that's not being done now. So somebody needs to collect all those people together.
Yeah, I mean, to get those skills, and of course...
And those are the people who are going to do the negotiation with the counterpart in Westminster. So somebody would need to be getting those people together quickly if the 18 months was going to focus on the most important issues.
Mike Tholen, did you have anything?
I've not got much I can add to that on some very effusive comments.
Thank you.
You have something on this point?
A couple of points ago, but certainly to...
Because Joan McAlpin's keen to come in as well, so I'll maybe take Dennis first, then Joan, and then you.
Very, very brief supplementary, and it was a point that Alex Kemp mentioned, but I'll maybe take it to Mike. And it was the roundabout of skills. The Bank of Scotland came out with a report saying there's a huge skill shortage within the industry. Has the industry done enough to address the skill shortage, and in particular the gender imbalance?
Gosh, I'll take the two subjects slightly separately. First of all, on the skills side, we are continuing to do an awful lot. Every company is reliant wholly on its human resource to be successful, and that's as much for our industry as any other. So we are actively not just pursuing the undergraduates and graduates, but also the mature workforce, where we need many, many people of a great deal of expertise, not just within the oil companies, but within supply companies that service the industry, particularly offshore. The down manning there has been within the armed forces, and the continued reduction in the armed forces, has surreally been an excellent source, and continues to be an excellent source of labour. I know there is competition between here and not least Grangemouth, and some of the companies within Grangemouth sometimes for the skills there as well. So the industry is an attractive employer, and at a time still fairly difficult employment for the UK. That has been a beacon. The work that EY published last week shows that average salaries across the hundreds of thousands of people, average salaries are into the 45 to 50,000 mark, which shows you a big positive contribution of our industry to the economy and as a big attraction. When it comes to the gender balance, I'm pleased to say Oil and Gas UK, my own company, actually I think it's more than 50% female content, and there's a good mix across all of the levels within the organisation. And increasingly within companies, you are seeing companies recognising that we need to employ both male and female in every opportunity we can and at every location we can.
Is that an onshore and offshore?
And most certainly. I have to say, the first time I went offshore 30 years ago, it would have been inconceivable to see women offshore. These days, you see many of them fulfilling a whole range of roles, from both junior all the way through to most senior roles offshore.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Okay. Joan McAlpin.
Or is this my question?
No, this is your question.
This is my.
You can ask me supplementary if you want, but
I'm on, am I?
You're on.
Well, my question is I've got a number of questions. Mr. Tholen Your organisation's gone on record as saying that the North Sea sector contributed 40 billion to the UK's balance of payments in 2011. What do you think the effect on the UK would be to lose that contribution to its balance of payments?
Gosh, the UK economy has benefited hugely from the oil and gas and from the services, the goods and services which come increasingly from within the UK to support that sector. I think we will be a poorer country in every sense of the word if we didn't have access to those skills, those resources, and to the wealth it generates to the nation. So we would be a poorer country because of it.
Yeah. You mentioned earlier in your evidence the Scottish Government's Fiscal Commission, and you'll be aware that one of the recommendations of the Fiscal Commission was a sterling currency zone shared between an independent Scotland and the remainder of the UK. And you'll also, of course, be aware that the Chancellor, George Osborne, has said that he would not permit independent Scotland to use sterling as a currency. What would the effect on your sector be of Scotland not being allowed to use, they're not allowed a sterling zone? Obviously we can use sterling if we want, but not having sterling?
I think in one sense we have to see how the situation develops and how those arrangements develop were there to be an independent Scotland. As an industry, we are used to working with many currencies in many situations. So clearly, currency itself is not a barrier to business. Even around the North Sea, we have krona, we have euros, we have pounds. The challenge for us, not least around the financial side, but more broadly, as has been mentioned by the other folks on the panel as well, is the uncertainty that any period of change would engender to our industry. At a time when we are a mature industry, we want the opportunity to invest with the knowledge we know how that money will be treated, where the money is going, and how the bills are going to be paid, and who we're paying our own taxes and the like too as well. So the need for uncertainty, or the need for certainty and clarity as quickly as possible on these things would be, I think, what our industry would press for, rather than there being a decision on one way or the other.
So given that comment that you've just made, what did you think of the Chancellor's comments about Scotland not being allowed to use sterling?
That is his position to make as
Do you
Chancellor.
think that helped? Did that help certainty for your industry?
I think it helps that all sides in the debate make their views known, and in the case of independence, that we know what the outcome is as soon as possible.
Yeah.
It is not for us to determine as an industry the democratic choices of two countries as they go through some negotiations, if that is to be the case.
Right. Because Crawford Beveridge, the head of the Fiscal Commission, when he was in front of this committee a few weeks ago, said that he believed that the day after a yes vote, the views of the UK government would completely change, because it was in the interests of businesses in the rest of the UK for Scotland to be sharing sterling. Would you care to comment on that?
As I say, I think it's best that we see what the decisions of the governments are, and then we as an industry have to live with those consequences.
You must have some idea in terms of your members what their preference would be for the currency.
I haven't discussed that subject with
You
them.
haven't discussed it, right? Okay then.
Sorry.
Thanks. And I have a couple of questions for Penelope. Yeah, on a completely different topic. I was interested when you talked about the number of treaties that had been written and the fact that a decision was made that they would be written in English law. Two different things, I think. There are 13,000 treaties currently in the UK, so that if Scotland became independent, those treaties which the UK hold with other countries all over the world would have to be negotiated and agreed between Scotland and those countries. The English law point is that all the contracts which govern the offshore oil industry, it's a matter of history really. In 1964 they were all set to be governed by English law because of the difference between English law and Scots law, and I'm qualified in both, is
different in the realm of tax and trusts. And it all goes down to something called the Joint Operating Agreement, which is the way that people hold the licences in the North Sea, that they hold those licences as tenants in common, which is a very sort of technical thing under English law.
I don't really need to go into that level of detail. I think what the point I'm driving at is that the work that was generated, I think the convener mentioned jobs for lawyers. I take it that there would have been a lot of work for corporate lawyers,
I mean,
and trained in English law.
I mean, horrendous. Well, yes, if we were to change the whole regime of what must be many, many, many thousands of agreements which are in force in the North Sea, from English law to Scots law, well, yes, it would keep me in business for 20 years.
Yeah.
But
no, I'm not suggesting that. But I'm just asking you to make an observation in that these North Sea arrangements have been conducted by corporate lawyers trained in English law, and if it had been corporate lawyers trained in Scots law, I think there would have been a lot more work here in Scotland.
Well, I can comment on that because that's actually interesting, because I set up my office in Aberdeen in 1993. At that time, no law firm in Aberdeen was advising the industry on either English law or Scots law. And it was understood at that time that all that work, because the contracts were governed by English law, were done remotely from London. I set up my office in order to actually help the industry locally on the ground, and because of what I did, you now have about 12 firms in Aberdeen who do oil and gas law in terms of both English law and Scots law. So I brought that expertise, not just for my firm, but for a lot of firms into Aberdeen, which has been a very, very positive thing for Aberdeen.
Sure.
But there is a technical problem in terms of there will be more litigation if you muddle up. It doesn't matter whether it's English law and Scots law. If it was Scots law and Norwegian law, or any combination of laws, you can't really have two different legal regimes governing a complex suite of arrangements, because then if there is an accident, which unfortunately we are in a high-risk industry, the lawyers can then actually increase litigation by going between the two legal systems. So that's not helpful.
Sure, I totally take that point. I think basically what I'm driving at is, notwithstanding the great work that your company have done and others that have followed in your wake, a large amount of this corporate law work to do coming from a Scottish natural resource has been done in England.
I think more and more it's actually done in Aberdeen now, because the expertise there, and not only in Aberdeen as regards the North Sea, but in Aberdeen for all kinds of parts in the world, like Brazil, China, Africa, where the oil industry works. So actually that expertise is very largely in Aberdeen now.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Rising operating costs. This will be a question for Mr. Tholen. There's a lot of reference to the rising operating costs. I think we all recognise that. And I can see as an industry you would want to keep operating costs down. Coming from a parliamentary/governmental perspective, if operating costs are incurred with businesses based in Scotland, we're still generating economic activity in Scotland, and that's perhaps for us a more mixed picture. So what is the extent that you foresee operating costs being ploughed into the supply chain in Scotland, providing either further R&D, more specialist equipment, more specialist personnel, or how much of it would be likely to leave the Scottish economy?
I think you highlight a very good point in terms of the benefits and the activity of the industry. In one sense, it is quite valuable to take a step back from simply the tax returns the industry makes, and indeed the balance of payments benefits of just simply the production. As you look around, not least around here, around Aberdeen, but around Scotland, and indeed across the UK as a whole, our footprint is increasingly one of the industry being serviced by the UK and UK capabilities. Firms like AMEC, like Wood Group, a whole range of companies have built international businesses out of their competencies in the UK, not just as oil companies, most particularly within supply chain. And I'd say something like 80% of that money within the supply chain really ricochets through the economy. The work that was published last week by EY, which we commissioned with the Scottish Government and with the British Government, looked very positively on the much broader contribution. Say the turnover of the supply chain is in excess of 20 billion, with another 14 billion of exports. These are big numbers within our industry and big numbers to the UK economy.
So, therefore, while they're costs to your industry, perhaps in a broader sense, you could rank them alongside other things where you would look at economic multipliers and view them perhaps more positively in language.
There are probably less than 30,000 people who work directly for an oil company, be it a big or small oil company. There is a multiplier probably 10 times that of the people who work for the oil company, and we see that with the 50 or 60,000 that go every year working offshore as well. So a huge multiplier benefit, and one which shouldn't be discounted in the total consideration of our activities.
And then to change the subject entirely, and I would throw this over to anyone, there was a reference before as well earlier to European Union membership in the event of a yes vote. How interested would the industry be in European Union membership in the event of a no vote, given that there is a promise of a referendum on a British exit in 2017, with the likelihood that if that were to be held, there would be, based on the polls today, a no vote and a British exit? Is that something the oil industry is sensitive towards, or is that something that it would just bat away?
Any other comment on that?
It is honestly one that we've actually not, I think it's not one that I actually converse with member companies on. I suspect it's still a little far away in many people's psyche at the minute. Yeah.
So it'd be fair to say it's not really at the top of the risk register right now because people aren't thinking about it yet, or talking about it at least.
Okay, thank you. We've probably got time for a question each then from Lewis MacDonald and from Christian Allard. So, Lewis MacDonald first.
Thank you very much, Convener. And I'd like to go back, if I may, to some of the early discussion around the actual process in the event of a yes vote of disentangling the regulatory, fiscal and licensing regimes in the Scottish sector of the North Sea from the North Sea general, or the UK continental shelf in general. I noted that it was said that individual companies had not made any assessment of the likely costs, which was quite a surprising revelation. Perhaps it indicates that companies don't think it's a real risk. I'm not sure. But I'd be very interested to know if anyone, either any of the witnesses are aware of any work that's been done in relation to the costs the industry would face. For example, Penelope Warne talked about a very large number of people required in order to rewrite the regulatory regime in a Scottish context, and also the very critical issue of who would negotiate on Scotland's behalf with DEC and the Treasury. Those seem to be very significant questions and potentially with very significant costs, and I wonder if any of the witnesses would like to comment on those. I know Kemp has also done work in the past on the costs of that might arise around some of these issues if, for example, a separate regulatory regime is required.
Well, I've said something about the nature of the cost. How big they would be is very difficult to say. So, I mean, as far as industry is concerned, there would be what we would call compliance costs. So, they would have to divide their operations in the North Sea between a Scottish-based and rest of UK-based. They would have to produce all their tax returns for the Scottish sector as distinct from the rest of the UK sector. So there would be some compliance costs for the industry. For governments, well, clearly, the Scottish Government would have to acquire expertise in policy determination for licensing, regulations and taxation. Policy implementation, they might have a separate group of experts like we have in DEC and like we have in HMRC, or it's possible that they might use the shared competence concept, and they might contract HMRC and the new regulator to do the regulation and the taxation implementation on their behalf. These are the nature of the obvious compliance costs that would be involved. How big they would be, I find it very difficult to know.
Not involved. I wonder.
Probably the cost is not the major problem. I think the major problem is actually, getting on and doing it, and the speed and efficiency and the pre-planning to do, as much as is possible early enough so it can all be put in place.
And I wonder, Mike, you said that companies haven't done individual cost assessments, but does the industry have a sense of what the cost implications might be for the industry of an additional regime, if you like, within the North Sea Basin?
It's not something we've actually sat down to try and evaluate in terms of the costs of doing it. Clearly, in a period of very big transition, when there is a very limited resource to the right expertise, there is a risk of a lot going wrong. And that would concern us as an industry to hope that both countries, in the case of independence, devote the right resources to sustain and develop the conversation in the right way. I would say, though, that if the costs of compliance might ultimately be less for some of the bigger companies who are operating offshore, the costs for the supply chain who service people offshore from across the UK could well be more significant. So we have to look at all corners of the business, were there to be independence, for the impact on those companies. It goes well beyond just the folks who have the licenses to extract oil and gas in the first place. Yeah.
No conflict.
Thanks very much, Convener. Good afternoon. I just wanted to go back to what we are just now. The sector is booming. We've got investment like we've never seen before. And I think that maybe was not explored enough this morning. Total 3.3 billion. Now BP has decided to invest in the North Sea. So we see that this investment is happening, that the industry is confident enough to provide that kind of investment. Now, we heard this morning that there's a problem about government thinking only in 5 years period instead of thinking about 25 years period. Now, I hear, Penelope, Warne, in your written evidence, I read that you will address, this paper is addressing following a positive vote for independence. But really, we need to think about into futures, if in the unlikely event, I would say, that the people of Scotland will vote no. Are we confident enough that at this time of high investment in the region, in the basin, and following Sir Ian Wood's report, that Westminster government, whatever happened to the Westminster government in 2015, is equipped enough to take that big challenge of looking after a mature investment coming from this industry? Mike, maybe you wanted to go on?
Gosh, so the investment is booming now, not least we see some massive numbers being published in terms of activity. There is one sense where the money just doesn't go as far as it used to, unfortunately. What you could buy with your pounds now in terms of barrels of oil being developed is a lot less than you could have done 10 years ago. So the money is typically 4 or 5 times less effective than it was. So that does play into part of the headlines. We've also seen that the big developments going on now really caught the headlines in terms of activity. And looking ahead, companies are more uncertain as to what the next big opportunities are in the North Sea and how they get around to developing those, partly because things are more expensive, and partly because with aging infrastructure, you have to find new ways to tie those into old facilities. So the industry is at a crossroads, where it's looking hard at the next phase in its game, and as part of that, to sustain the recipe which involves a Wood Review, involves a strong focus on a mature, long-term, successful industry is essential, as an essential recipe for us, if you like.
So the industry is asking for confidence from
It needs to have confidence. Really, I think Serene put it best, that tripartite relationship between itself, the regulator, and the government around the fiscal environment together, so you can create a recipe of long-term success. It's been a great journey. It gets more difficult, but we can get there, but it's not an easy task.
We've got great expertise in Aberdeen. Do you think that expertise, for example, the regulator, should be in Aberdeen? Should you have more of that?
There is a huge amount of expertise in Aberdeen, and indeed, there is still quite a bit of expertise outside Aberdeen as well. The regulator currently is based, it has a big footprint in Aberdeen, and it also has a footprint out of London, not least to be able to service the southern North Sea and some of the onshore activities as well. So I imagine that the regulator will look to build on those strengths. It would be very surprising if it didn't in what it's going to do.
I think I agree with everything that Mike said, that whether there is an independent Scotland or not, whichever government needs to absolutely support the continuity and investment into the industry.
Well, we are at an important point in
absolutely,
this.
and with actually more to do as a result of the Wood Review, which is for the benefit of the industry, but it requires everybody to pull together on that.
The Wood Review takes the example of Norway, Professor Kemp. Do you think that we should take a lot more examples from Norway from now on?
Okay, well, can I say first of all that I think that the Wood Review has been extremely timely, and that it has pinpointed the idea that the industry is at a crossroads, and its diagnosis I thought was excellent, and the fact that the UK government and the Scottish government have accepted the main ideas in the Wood Review, I think, is encouraging. The fact that there's going to be a full-scale tax review is also encouraging, and that is recognition, I think, that there is a crossroads. Norway, as well, it's obviously comparable in an obvious sense. It's in the North Sea, but in terms of the prospectivity, the fields on average are a good bit bigger. The prospectivity in terms of exploration success rates is better, and the policy framework is different. Mike highlighted some of the main taxation differences, but in addition, it's dominated by state companies. You've got Statoil and you've got Petroleum, and if you look at all the blocks, all the fields together, these two constitute a very big share. So there is a question there. The Wood Review just hints a little bit at possible advantages of state participation, not only in Norway, but in the Netherlands, for encouraging exploration. And it would be quite a big step ideologically for anybody in any party in Scotland or in England to resuscitate direct state equity participation because of the ideological battles of the past. Whereas in Norway, or indeed in the Netherlands, it's not such a big ideological issue. The Woods Review does actually mention that for certain places, like west of Shetland, where the geological, geophysical data are not well known, that the state might actually finance some of that. So the big difference with Norway is the prospectivity and so on, but also in the role of the state. And well, from a non-ideological point of view, I can see a case where a state equity or funding of seismic even a smaller scale could actually help things.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
I'm afraid time has overtaken us. I'm sorry, due to the absence of our Green member, we never got onto the whole climate change issue, which I'm sure had Alison Johnson been here, she would have pursued vigorously, but we'll leave that for another day. We have to call it a day at that. Can I thank you all very much for coming along and spending your time with the committee. It's been very helpful to our inquiry to have your evidence this afternoon. That concludes our formal business here at Aberdeen. Can I just put on record again my thanks to the staff at the University of Aberdeen for all their assistance in the arrangements for today. And with that, I close the meeting. Thank you. Very good.